Hello, everyone, and welcome to our latest episode on the Awaken Voices podcast. Today, as our guest, we have our cherished faculty member, Clare Walker, with me, and we're going to talk about values. So, Claire, maybe you want to say a few words about yourself before we dive into the topic.
Yeah, thanks, Eve. Yeah. So my name is Clare Walker. I work mainly for Vodafone, which is, those people who don't know, it is a telecoms company. But I'm also faculty member for Awaken, which is great because I did my PCC training with Awaken, probably about 4 years ago. Um, and so, yeah, I'm now PCC. I'm also a group coach. I also went through the Daring Greatly course with Awaken. I'm also in the middle of doing my supervision qualification, and I'm a type coach, professional, all sorts of bits and pieces, lots of different strings to my bow. But predominantly an internal coach who looks after about 120 internal coaches, but also look after our external team as well.
Yeah. And I know you from many community events and other opportunities where you always, spread this warm and loving vibe. And I'm really curious to dive into the topic of values with you. So maybe to get us started, you can share a little bit about what are values actually.
Yeah, values are something that we don't consider very often. They are the thing that make up pretty much our unique essence. They're the thing that make us who we are, and they drive us, they motivate us. They are the things that can cause us friction. They're the things that can bring us a huge amount of happiness as well when our values are met. When our values are not met or are disrespected, we can get that, even if it can either be the grain of sand in the shoe kind of feeling, or it can be something much, much more powerful than that. But as I say, we don't investigate them very much in ourselves. But when we do, we can really start to live by them and understand why we behave in a certain way, why things might annoy us, but we can also then start to understand the values of the people around us. And when we do that, it can give us a real congruence and a real join and connectedness. Because when we can honour other people's values as well as our own, it can really make life good.
So there's already a lot of richness in what you're sharing around, like, first of all, them being like a guiding principle kind of, or an anchor to align to, but then also, um, how it sets the tone of engaging with others, or also understanding subconscious friction that can occur or conflicts that can arise. And what do you think makes it important for us to become more conscious or aware of our values?
Yeah, I think, in the same way when sometimes we think about emotions, and people can normally name three emotions: sad, mad, and glad, and that's pretty much as far as they get. It's very similar with values. People will tell you, yes, I have a value around honesty, or I have a value around sharing, or I have a value around money. It might be that. But when we start, like the emotions wheel, and we suddenly have that big wheel that has lots of emotions on it, and we can start to identify and drill down a little bit more actually into what our values are. And we suddenly start to realize that what we thought might have been one of our big values actually isn't, because there's other things that sit behind it. So we sometimes hear people who say, yeah, I really value money and wealth. And you think, okay, but they have no money left at the end of their month. It's probably because they are valuing social status or fun or potentially something else above the actual money itself. It's what comes with money that they value if they have none left at the end of the month. But it can also be when people talk about things like wealth, that it's not wealth that they're actually talking about. When you start to drill down into definitions of values, I spoke to somebody one day, and he said that his top value was wealth. And when we started to ask about it, he said that wealth is not about how much I've got in my bank account or my wallet. The wealth for me means that I have got clothes in my wardrobe, I've got shoes on my feet, I've got food in my fridge. but I also have a phone full of numbers of people that I know that I can call when I need them. And so if we can start drilling down into not just what the different values are, but also what they mean to us and how they show up, then again, we can really start to understand why we do things, why we avoid things as well. We can have values and therefore we avoid them. You know, if you have a value around solitude and inner peace, you're probably not going to be, it's Glastonbury this weekend, you're probably not going to want to be in the middle of a tented crowd in Glastonbury if that's what your value is. So you would avoid that because your value around solitude is so strong to you. So being able to drill down and really identify what feels like a value to you when even just looking at the word of it, can really start to resonate. And then you start to understand. And when you can either voice those values or have conversations about them, the connections you have with other people or the understanding you have with yourself can just grow and grow and grow and become really powerful.
Yeah, it's so interesting. I remember like when we once did a team workshop on values, what we did was building a word cloud with all the values that would be most important to us. But then what was really interesting is that there were some words that multiple people chose. And then when we dove deeper into what they actually meant and how they showed up, all the answers for every person would be so different and would be so individual to based on their experience, based on what made this specific word or value especially important to them. So it's, I think, one step of like being aware of your values, but then also to engage with others in this conversation and like just exploring this word, because for me also values are and maybe you can speak to that as well. Um, they're kind of like intangible in most ways. They're not able to be put in a box, like, for example, things like lightness or love or fascination or these kind of things where you're like, could put a lot of different interpretations into, but you cannot necessarily like grab them or hold them or do something with them. It's more a subtle, um, yeah,
Yeah.
subtle thing.
Yeah, and you're absolutely right. I mean, I do this as an exercise with people within the company, and we ask people to choose from. We give them a deck of 96 different cards to choose from, and ask them to choose their top 10. And then when they've got their top 10 in front of them, we ask them to choose one that is probably the one that they can't live without. It's the one that is not negotiable. And then what we do is ask them, if they're happy to tell people what that top one is and why it's so important to them. And so what we hear at that point are things that people never knew. You're absolutely right. It's not like a skill. It's not like a talent. They're quite often your values are hidden. And it's until you start talking to people about them that people don't understand how important a certain value can be to you. And we had one gentleman, his top value, he put as humour. And his boss said to him, I didn't know that humour was so important to you. How can we bring that into your job? How can we, we're not all going to, be telling jokes every day and having, the hilarity and not getting work done. But how do we bring humour more into what you do on a daily basis? And he said, if I could just put some humour or a bit of fun or something into my slide presentations or when I go to speak to customers, it would just mean I could bring a bit of me, and it would mean I was being a bit more authentic. Authentic is a value that comes up a lot. And I could therefore be more authentic. And his boss said, go for it. Just please, if that's your value, then we're going to honour that and we're going to, we'll allow that to happen because it's important to you. And he started then putting humour, his value, into his presentations. His sales results went up because all of a sudden he was being human, because he was bringing a part of himself into those presentations. And all of a sudden it made a difference to how he presented. And therefore the feedback that he got was that he got more sales and more items on his book. So knowing what those are can be really important, in the same way that when you know somebody's values, you can behave in ways that respect them so that you get the best from that person. I had two people on my team. One had a high value around inner peace. The other one had a high value around leadership and strategy. And so if I had to have a conversation with them about the same topic, one of them I would say, let's go out for a walk. Let's go get some sunshine, some fresh air, latte, whatever. Let's go and have a nice walk. And we'd have a conversation and it would be very calm. And we would get said what we need to get said, and we would get, the topic would be investigated. With the other person, it would be, okay, I booked a meeting room. We're going to be 20 minutes. Here's the agenda. Let's go. Bang. And we could have exactly the same topic, but we would do it in a much more structured way because that was the way that they performed best and took in information best, having it in this very structured way, whereas the other person preferred it if it was much more conversational and fulfilling. And so it was really nice to know that different people have different ways of communicating because of their values as well.
Yeah, so what I hear you say is like knowing your values has like a lot of benefits. First of all, like with you being more aligned in the behaviors and actions that you take that ultimately make you more fulfilled to some extent or satisfied with how you live your life. But then also it really supports in creating deep or deepening our connections with others because we understand them better and we're better able to engage with them in a way that actually meets their needs and meets their desires. Is that right to say?
Absolutely. Yeah, totally. Two stories for you. One, very simply, I have a value around solitude and inner peace. I'm an introverted energy taker, and I love just having time on my own. And so, because my husband and I have had the conversations, lots of times, I can raise my solitude flag and just say, look, my value around solitude just doesn't feel like it has had a lot of attention right now. I'm going to go for a walk on my own. You've done nothing wrong, but I'm just going to go because I need that value to be topped up a little bit right now. And he'll say, he's very, very similar to me. So he'll go, that's fine. He'll either go, I'm going for a walk in the opposite direction, or he'll say, I'll come for a walk with you, but we won't actually talk. And that's fine because we're together with solitude. And so it's fine. Being able to voice that value is great. In the same way, I had a friend, a colleague, who had a value around risk aversion. She didn't like risk at all, so she had a value around safety. Um, Whereas I have a value also around just go and get it done, go experiment, just go try it. It's fun. And so we used to kind of not, we didn't meet in the middle all the time because she was very much, I need to write a paper on this. I need to get sign off on it. I need approvals. Whereas I was just, let's go see what happens. And then we can have some, some fun. So we used to have to raise our flags and go, here's my risk showing up. Can we try this first? And I'd say, absolutely. And we would consider her risks. And then we would consider can we just go do this and just see what happens? And then we'll make a change. So our two values were very different, but it meant we could work together very, very nicely. And then you were saying about, when you honor those values and it can make a change into the way that you are. Um, I when I very, very first did this values exercise, I did it with, I've got a pack of cards here that they're like playing cards, and there's 96 of them. And each one of them has a different value on it. And they're absolutely wonderful. And what we do when we're doing the exercise is we sort these 96 cards into three different piles. Your top 10, the ones that you look at one and you go, no, that's not me. You can discard it. It's not going to be in your top 10. And then there's a hold pile that says it might be in my top 10, not quite decided yet. And when I first did it and I ran through all of these cards, I was on the train home and I thought, I'm going to come home and I'm going to do this with my husband because I've been married for 33 years. I'm going to go through, and I went through the cards and I thought, this is going to be his top 10. They're going to be up here. And when I came home and went through and then let him go through the exercise and do the choose his top 10 cards, his top 5 weren't even in the 10 that I'd chosen for him.
Wow.
Yeah. Yeah, wow, that's what I thought. But being a coach, I sat there and went, oh, okay, that's interesting. Can you tell me what those top 5 mean to you or those top 10 mean to you? And what can I do that means that they show up more for you? And it was a really interesting conversation. And actually, His number one value was about belonging. But this goes back to your explanation and what your definition of that word is. And his word of belonging wasn't necessarily I need to be in a group holding hands with everybody and know that, I'm signed up and my name's on a list. It wasn't about that. It was about acknowledging his presence and just seeing him. And that was it. There was nothing wrong with our marriage at all. There was, it was fine. We everything was absolutely fine. It was about just walking through the kitchen and putting my hand on his shoulder and going, hey, that just grounded him, that went, yeah, you know that I'm here, I know that you're here. Sounds very, very simple, but it made such a difference to the way that we communicated, was just letting him know that I had seen him in the room, whatever, just that hello, just that hand on the shoulder, just that, even the small reminders of, I saw that you did this, thank you. That we don't do, and especially after 33 years, you don't go, thank you for emptying the dishwasher so much anymore. But that was actually what, changed us. And you may say, okay, so that was about gratitude as well. It might have been about something different, but actually it just really made a difference to, as I say, the way that we then lived in the house. So yeah, it can absolutely. And if you imagine that you have a colleague who has a top value around punctuality, and you aren't particularly into punctuality, you're just somebody who turns up when you turn up and it's fine. But they have that and it's quite strong with them. You can imagine when you turn up a minute late that they go, and they feel they're going, you're a minute past, is it? You can feel that friction going on inside them. And so therefore walking into a room, even a minute late, and catching their eye and saying, I'm sorry, I know I'm a minute late, shows that you have respected their value. And that you might be a minute late because you were doing something like talking to somebody at the coffee machine to make sure they were okay, which is your empathy value. It might have been that did that. Doesn't mean that your value trumps their value at any point, but what it does mean is that you can respect their value and say, I'm sorry, I know that I disrespected your value around punctuality. That's fine. You don't have to go into your explanation if you don't want to, but it just means that person doesn't then think that you have disrespected their value, which is very different. So yeah, talking about values is so important so that you can then understand why people act in certain ways, why even their emotions are showing up in certain ways. It is where we write our own rule book. Our rule book comes from our personal values.
Thank you so much for those examples. And I find it very funny because I realized that the values work it never ends. Like we're evolving and we're reframing, and some values stay with us over a very long period, but sometimes they also shift. And from my experience with my last boyfriend, where I also was training to become a coach, so I was into all these topics, and I purposefully also invited the conversation around our top 10 values. It was really interesting because he mentioned as one of his top values fun or humor also. And for me, it was really supporting me in the deepening of our connection to know what the things are that he values most in the context of relationship. Because what I heard you saying is also pointing out different contexts, and I believe that we probably have some core values that play out in different situations, but then there are also values that are very much centered, or that are very much context specific.
Yeah. Context specific and situation specific as well. When I do this exercise with the people at work, they say, am I looking at home values or work values? And I say, just go through the cards and see what comes up. And so it will be sometimes that your values will swap around and change. I heard a lovely definition of this the other day, or a metaphor around it the other day, that said your values are like the bubbles in your bubble bath, that you will probably have one big one and there'll be other ones around it. But if that big one pops, then all the others around have to sort of reform themselves, and it will feel different. And so, absolutely. So, if you imagine that you have critical illness, your values will change. You may stop being very work specific and very much about leadership and power. And you may suddenly go into being much more about well-being and your health. So yeah, it very, very much that your values will change over time. I always say when we pick out our top 10 values, when we're doing the exercise, don't have them printed on a t-shirt because they will change. They are a moment in time. And you will find that they will swap and change, but you're absolutely right. You will probably have a core set that will move up and down a little bit. But that's when it becomes interesting, where you start looking at, where do I want to focus my energy, and where do I want to, um, what do I need to change so that I can either reach a goal or do something differently. And I had this with someone I was coaching, and we did this, and he laid out his cards and he had down his top 10, and we kind of put them into some sort of an order, and he had them. He was a singer in a band, and at number one, he had his social. Number two, he had music. And then number three, he had family. And one of his reasons for coaching was that he was going through some real family difficulties at that point. And so when we laid out his values, we said, what is your feeling around family being number three, and yet your band and your music being number one and two? What effect do you think that might have, and what do you want to do about it? So, of course, we had a coaching conversation, and he recognized he needed to put more focus and energy into his family at that point to reach the goal of, everything being okay and sticking together, which he did. And, sort of 5, 6 years later, it's all good and it's fine. But recognizing that that's where his value needed to be upped the list, then that's where he did that. So yeah, they're not set in stone. They will move around. And it's a great way of looking at why something doesn't feel good, because if you're feeling very drained about something and it's feeling conflicted to you, you can have a look and say, well, what's going on here? Which of my values are not being met and which are not being respected? And I had this when I was working for a company. I have, as you were saying, core values. My three of my core values are honesty, integrity, and fairness. And I was working for a company, and I've worked for them for quite a number of years, but things changed. And when I did this exercise, probably about 6 years after I'd left the company, I suddenly realized, when my values of honesty, integrity, and fairness came up, that's why when the company changed, they weren't being met in the same way that they had been beforehand. And yeah, I left the company and I always thought, did I do the right thing? But when I did this exercise after the event, I went and looked back and thought, I did exactly the right thing, because my values at that point were not up there at the top. And I couldn't change the company, these circles of control. There was nothing I could do to change what the company was doing. And so I left because it didn't feel right to me. And I was actually, even 5, 6 years later, felt very proud of myself for leaving, even though I hadn't recognized at that point it was because of my values. So it's wonderful for either after the event, having just an internal conversation, or even during an event, why am I feeling like this right now? Can be because one of my values doesn't feel like it's up there right now. It's not getting the attention it needs, or somebody is behaving in a way that doesn't sit with my values, and therefore that's feeling bad for me as well.
Yeah. Ah, that is like, um, wait, what was I about to say? I will cut this part, but like, wait, I had a question. I had, so what you were mentioning as an entry point also to engaging with values, seems to be like, for people who, for example, probably with these cards might have a difficult time of knowing what their values are, to be thinking back to moments in the past where either you felt like in a specific context you were triggered, or it felt very complicated or difficult to be in that situation, or to go to the opposite side of the scale probably, and to imagine like things where you really felt seen and heard and valued and really expansive in your experience. And I think both of these ends of the scale can inform, um, or support in finding out one's values. And from the exercise that you mentioned, from my own experience, it was so hard to nail them down to 10. Like it felt almost like things were pulled out of me when I had to decide, like, I now remove these three from my list, or I bring it down to one, like defining this value hierarchy, I think that you were also referring to, like which one is more important than the other. Like this can feel like such an inner battle almost. And yeah, do you think it's something, or is there a tool that you could use to find out also more about the hierarchy of the values that you
Yeah,
have?
and I was doing this recently with somebody, and you say it's really difficult to choose which ones because, as I say, you're going through, 96 cards of, collaboration, and you're looking at tolerance, and you're looking at, pleasure. But there's ones in there about, friendship and hope and intelligence. And you look at them and you think, gosh, I don't know. But I had someone I was doing this with them the other day. They picked up one of the cards and they looked at it and they burst into tears because it felt so visceral and so strong to them that they held it there, and it was like, wow. So of course we talked about that and we coached through what was important to them, and what that card meant to them. There are other cards within that pile that you'll go, no, it's not there. Fame, art, never are in my top 10. It doesn't mean that I don't value them to a point, but what we're really looking for is just to investigate your top 10, to see how they sit with you and where they find. But what we do is when we've got the top 10 written out, as I say, that number one is often it's not easy to find, but to identify it, it's normally we look at it and we recognize that it is probably the umbrella that sits on top of all the other ones. So if I don't have my family, then, nothing else sits below it. If I don't have my health, then everything else below that disappears. If I don't have wealth, it might be everything else below that doesn't sit straight. So it may be that you choose one that's on the top. So what we then ask people to do, we choose them out of that top 10. It's really hard to choose the one that they could potentially do without for an hour, a day, a week. It might be, it's out of 96. So we ask them for one, and they will look at it and go, okay, this is the one that I can flex on because, and it might be I can flex on punctuality because I recognize things happen. Sometimes you are late. I can flex on leadership because sometimes I have to do things on my own. And so they will then look at where their number 10 is. And so what we then ask them to do is choose two of the other values that are on that list and take the cards and put one in each one of the hands. So at the moment, I've got hope and intelligence there. And what we ask them to do is to close their eyes and feel which one actually feels more important to them. And it might be lighter, it might be heavier, don't know, but one of them, you will get an indication that one of them is more important to you. Hope, I immediately, as soon as I put it in my hand, I felt that that one was the one that was more important to me. And so you would put that slightly further up the list. But it's great when you're trying to make a decision. If you have to make a values-based decision on something as well, then it might be, am I talking about here? Imagine that you have to make a decision between honesty and speed. So, if I say that my honesty is that I drive at 30 miles an hour, but, if I don't turn up in the next 3 minutes and it's going to take me 4 minutes to get there, my granddaughter's going to come out of school and nobody's going to be there to pick her up. Imagine that was the scenario. Would I put my honesty of driving at the right speed above or below my speed of getting there on time? So you could kind of, I don't expect you to be driving and doing this, but you could mentally think, how do I decide which one of those two values I need to put forward at this point? And so it is a great way to be able to then put them into a 10 order, but as I say, they're not going to stay in that 10 order necessarily. They will change, but it gives you that ability to think, how do I make a decision on these two things? And to be honest, you can do that with most decisions because it's so close to your heart, you will feel it. But with the values, you can choose where they sit in that list. But it is delving into your soul to kind of come up and think, why is that value more important than a different one? How does it show up, and what do I do with it once I know that it's there? So it's a very powerful exercise to do.
Hmm. Yeah, and I also love about it that it taps into or supports in tapping into the body's wisdom, because there's so much, like we usually try to solve so many problems within our head, whereas we also have this really beautiful powerful vessel that we can ask for support in these kind of situations. And one thought that came up when you mentioned your granddaughter was also how I, because I imagine we also growing up receive or get not instructed. I think it's more a subtle thing probably, but like we're also taking on values of our culture and of our family. Um, and how do we decide, or how, when we can become conscious about it, how do we navigate in this space with like having our own values that might be supportive, but might also be conflicting with the values that we receive from our family or environment?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. We do. We get our values in our formative years. So we will, watch our parents, we will see what they do. As life goes on and you have events and conversations and personal emotions, you will change your values. And it might be that they stay similar to what you have within your family. I think some of the values that I have with my parents now, who are 83, 84 years old, are very, very similar. But even that age gap, what they consider as being a top value versus what I consider as being my top value, potentially are, or further down, probably the honesty, integrity, fairness probably are from my parents and from what I've grown up with. But when I get further down that list, I have a big value around music. They don't so much, but it was because that's what's in me and that's how I grew up. They, being 84, 85, have higher values around well-being. So, of course, theirs is much further up than mine. I need to have a value around well-being, otherwise I get sick and I can't do anything. But they will put more focus and more value on certain values. So they will change in time. And I'll say that there are some values that I have changed to be the opposite to my parents because of how I've seen the effects of a different generation. So there's very much, I would say my parents are very much about having conversations with the neighbours and talking to people, and they will have those sort of information gathering conversations with people. I'm the other side of that. I am so, and it's not just my ICF ethics policy and that I signed, but I am very much about confidentiality. And when I have a conversation with somebody, it's that one conversation and it stops. I'm not saying my parents are gossips, but they will have conversations and say, oh, and they will share information, whereas I don't. So I have very much a much stronger value around confidentiality. And if somebody gives me their news, it remains their news to tell other people, not their news for me to share with other people. So that's where there's kind of a difference, generation, and where I've seen somebody's value of sharing, and that's fine. Actually, I'm on the other side of that value where I'm very much more, and it's higher up about confidentiality.
Hmm. Yeah, I think for me, what speaks to me is that one of my values is choice. And if I hear you talk, then becoming aware of your values actually seems for me to be creating more choice, because then you can actively decide, like, is what my parents taught me or modeled me is actually also the way that I want to take my decisions, the way that I want to live my life, the way that I want to behave with other people.
Yeah, absolutely.
Is there anything else that you would like to share about values that we haven't mentioned yet?
I think one of the things really is, and well, we've kind of touched on it, but I think it is really important to just reiterate, is that I've done this exercise, the card exercise, with probably over 2,000 people. And we did it in 14 different countries. We did it in multiple different languages. And we found that, I think, even when we asked everybody to give their top 10, out of the 96 different values, we had 92 that were the top one. So it just shows you that, it's not that everybody has. We had one lady who said, but everybody must have the same value. Surely everybody's got love as their top value. No, we had 92 different values that came up as being somebody's number one. And I was talking to somebody the other day, and it's there again. It was somebody's number one value was intelligence. And so I had a conversation with them about how does that show up for you? What happens if you meet somebody who doesn't have intelligence? How does that change your conversation? So it's a real conversation starter as well. So we had all of those, and we did find that various different countries and cultures would have a slightly different top list. So whereas we found UK was very much family was their number one, Italy was love was their number one. And so it was nice and interesting to see where different cultures and different countries actually as a whole, their values were different as well. So it was very interesting to see how that happened. But I think, as we've touched on earlier, it's that whole thing about having the ability and the permission to voice your value when it comes up for you. So it may be, that your value is it may even be about something as simple as the level of the volume on the stereo or the radio at the time. I have a value around, a level value that says, here we go. Can we please just have the level down to a number 8? Whereas someone else might have, because of their value around fun and excitement and dancing, it might be they have it as a 12 because that's where they get their energy. That's fine, but you might just have to have that conversation so that you're not having that conflict. And it doesn't have to be the massive, great, big honesty, integrity sort of values that you're talking about. It doesn't have to be the whole of the braving trust elements that we're talking about that have that difference. I tell the story of my husband and I where I have a value around efficiency. He has one about clean lines and cleanliness. We both have it. It's just sometimes they conflict. So my efficiency about using the same cup and leaving it on the side annoys him because he has an efficiency value or a cleanliness value around putting it back in the cupboard or put it in the dishwasher. And so people say, I have the same thing about butter knives or shoes on the bottom of the stairs. But if you can just voice what that value is and say, my efficiency value means I use the same cup all day, whereas his cleanliness was, can you just put it away somewhere so I can't see it? It's fine. I just opened the cupboard and put it in the cupboard and closed the cupboard, and, he didn't have to look at it and I didn't have to wash it up 3 times a day. So yeah, it doesn't have to always be the massive great big values, but if you can just voice that value and say what it feels like for you when that value isn't met, then that's, it just helps with that congruence, with that less friction, and more connection with people, because then they understand you a little bit more and you can understand them a little bit more too.
I totally agree with that one. And I also think that like knowing your core values and like understanding that these are also foundational to feeling good in an environment. Like if you meet people who have similar core values than you do, then usually you immediately feel some kind of connection, even though the definition might be slightly different or the behaviors might be slightly different. But there is some kind of sensation of or feeling of connection once we engage with people that seem to be valuing the same things that we do.
Yeah, absolutely.
The last question that I always love to ask our guests on the podcast is, with your work, Claire, what world are you trying to create and wanting to be part of?
I am trying to create a world where people, it comes from this, it's one that keeps coming up for me time and time again. It's a Stephen Covey phrase, is first seek to understand and then be understood. Because I think if people just take the time to stop and listen and understand somebody else before they put in their point of view, their opinion, then I think it would be a much more understanding world. I think people would then really get to have information about where other people are standing, what their perspectives are, before they then step in. So yeah, that's my thing. First seek to understand and then be understood.
Thank you so much. I really enjoyed our conversation today.
Thank you. Can I just do a really an advert for these, just in case anybody does, just a blatant plug for them? They actually have my photo on the side of them as well. If anybody wants to, we've mentioned them throughout the podcast, you can get them from a company called makingbusinessmatters.co.uk, British company. And as I say, it's 96 cards. go and have a look at their website. They've got lots of different coaching cards. But yeah, I was very fortunate they made me a set especially as well, but you can go and buy them if you want to use them as well. But instructions are in the box of how to do it. So yeah, it's thank you for that as well.
Amazing.
Thank you, Eve. Really enjoyed talking to you.
Thanks to you too.